So what exactly is the JOBS Act? The JOBS Act is officially titled the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. It's a very catchy name, and the acronym becomes the JOBS Act. It was able to be easily used by people in Congress to try to, for political purposes, and became very useful for them on one level. But on a 10,000-foot level, there are really 6 different substantive provisions of the JOBS Act. Title I, as many of you might know, deals with emerging growth companies and the IPO on-ramp. It provides for such things as the confidential submission of registration statements, pre-filing testing the waters communications, exemptions from the say-on-pay, and some of the other provisions of the disclosure requirements of the securities laws, the audit or attestation requirements for internal control over financial reporting, and some other things like that. This title, the provision dealing with emerging growth companies, was effective upon enactment of the Act, and the panel is going to talk a lot more about that in detail. Title II deals with the elimination of general solicitation in Rule 506 and Rule 144A offerings. It required SEC rulemaking to become effective. The SEC rules were adopted finally in June of this year. It was supposed to be done within 45 days of enactment, which would have been around July 4th of 2012. But like I said, they finally adopted it in July of this year, and it just became effective on Monday. And basically, there is not much more to it than providing for the ability to do general solicitations in Rule 506 offerings, which has obviously been something a lot of people had wanted to do for a long time. At the same time the SEC adopted that change, they also adopted the bad actor provisions, restricting issuers with certain bad actors from relying on 506 in connection with some of their offerings. I'll touch a little bit more on this a little bit later when I get to the outlook, but the panel is also going to discuss both of these aspects in a lot more detail. Title III is a very interesting provision, and it deals with crowdfunding. Congress didn't define crowdfunding in the JOBS Act. Obviously, that was intentional to provide the greatest flexibility for both issuers who are trying to take advantage of it and ultimately, I think, for the regulators who are trying to define it and regulate it. But basically what it's designed to do is take a platform like a Kickstarter or one of the other donation-based platforms and apply it to the sales of securities. For those of you who don't know what Kickstarter is, basically people go on I'll use Kickstarter, but there are lots of other similar platforms. But basically what you do is you go onto the website. If somebody has an idea, they want to raise some money to try to take their idea somewhere, and they ask for donations. You can't sell securities that way as a general matter, although we're going to talk about one of the options that are available to issuers when we get to the panel. But basically, so people aren't expecting a return. They just think it's a great idea. It might be they like somebody's music and want to promote the music. It might be a variety of other things. And you might get a T-shirt, but you don't get a security. You don't get any other return. So basically what it does is it allows people to raise relatively small amounts in the aggregate of capital, but from a number of people using the internet and social media. The JOBS Act limits the amount that can be raised during any 12-month period to $1 million, and the amount that can be raised from any investor during that period is limited to $2,000 or 5% of their net worth or net income if their net worth or income is less than $100,000. Otherwise, it's 10% of their net worth or income. So as you can see, if you were able to find a really high net worth person, you might be able to raise $1 million from that person, but that's not really what crowdfunding is designed to do. The JOBS Act requires that transactions be conducted through a broker or funding portal, both of which will be regulated, and the JOBS Act also requires issuers to provide certain disclosures to investors. Finally, the JOBS Act imposed liability for misstatements or omissions in connection with the sale of securities, just like any other sale of securities. Title III of the JOBS Act requires SEC rulemaking to become effective. The SEC was supposed to have done their rulemaking by the end of 2012. We still haven't seen even proposed rules, let alone final rules. And so it will be a little bit unclear as to when we're going to see something. We now have the SEC now has a new chair who has said she wants to get all of this pending rulemaking out. So maybe we will see something. But the panel is going to talk about the crowdfunding, but in a different context, crowdfunding for accredited investors, which really isn't taking advantage of this provision, but it's taking advantage of the general solicitation provisions, which were Title II, which I previously talked about. Title IV of the Jobs Act deals with small company capital formation. It's commonly referred to as Reg A+. To me, this seems like it has the potential to be a big sleeper provision of the Jobs Act. It's not really talked about that much. It hasn't been subject to much pre-rulemaking comment or anything like that, like some of the other provisions. But I think it really might have an interest to a large group of investors. Basically, what Title IV does is allow issuers to raise up to $50 million in any 12-month period from any number of people. The securities can be sold publicly. They're not restricted. A registration statement doesn't need to be filed with the SEC, although certain information does need to be filed and need to be submitted to the SEC and provided to investors. Currently, there is a Reg A, which is why this one is called Reg A+. There's a Reg A, but that one's limited to $5 million. It's not used very often. You can probably count on one or two hands the number of people who have done Reg A offerings and filed information with the SEC. And I think part of the reason for that is because the maximum amount that can be raised that way is only $5 million, and I think companies think that there are other more efficient and cost-effective ways to raise capital than using Reg A. Like crowdfunding, Reg A is also subject to SEC rulemaking. It doesn't have any time period, and we also haven't seen any proposal yet. So those first four titles all deal with trying to ease capital formation under the Securities Act. The last two titles of the Jobs Act try to deal with deferring or delaying registration under the Exchange Act. Prior to the Jobs Act, under the Exchange Act, companies had to come register with the SEC and file reports if they had more than 500 holders of record of a class of equity securities. And what the Jobs Act did was add two titles which sort of modified that in different situations. Title V increased the number of security holders that of a record of a class of equity securities a company must have before it registers to either 2,000 holders of record or having 500 non-accredited investors. So it could increase dramatically the number of shareholders a company can have, that it can go out and raise capital from more people before it has to go register with the SEC. It does impose additional record keeping on companies if they want to try to assure that they have less than 500 non-accredited investors. But other than that, it really provides some advantages to companies. You also get to exclude, when you're determining your number of investors, shares that are sold through crowdfunding in Title III when that becomes available, or securities that are sold to employees pursuant to an employee compensation plan. It was effective upon enactment and doesn't require SEC rulemaking, but for those of you who practice in this area, there will be some inconsistencies between the existing SEC rules and the Jobs Act provision. The SEC will clean those rules up, but the Jobs Act provision controls because it changed the Securities Act as opposed to required SEC rulemaking to become effective. Title VI went further than Title V, and it's really only applicable to bank holding companies, and it just set a flat-out limit of needing 2,000 shareholders before you had to come register with the SEC. It also increased the number of shareholders. Let me step back. In order to stop registering with the SEC, you have to have less than 300 holders of a class. And with regard to bank holding companies, Title VI raised that to 1,200 shareholders. So basically, Title VI is designed to provide advantages to bank holding companies, and again, which are viewed as smaller companies, vital to community, smaller communities and things like that, and allow them to not have to register with the SEC. And like Title V, there will be some inconsistencies between existing SEC rules and the Jobs Act, but the Jobs Act does control. I think it's interesting to note that when you look at them, each of these provisions of the Jobs Act are really sort of targeting different audiences. The emerging growth company provisions in Title I were targeting the IPO process, companies that wanted to go public and things like that, and was designed to help facilitate that process and sort of reduce the cost, if possible, of doing an IPO. The general solicitation provisions are designed not for companies trying to go public, but rather to update certain private placement practices to reflect current practices, as well as the realities of the internet age and the ease of communication. Crowdfunding was designed to help ease initial fundraising for the small startup company or the person who has an idea and needs money in order to be able to develop that idea, and really sort of provide a way for them to attract some initial seed capital. The Reg A Plus provisions were designed to sort of help ease capital raising by smaller companies. They may already have an operation, they may have an idea, but they need money. Right now, we do see offerings in the public offerings in the $50 million range, but those require registration statements. They require a greater expense. Reg A Plus will help these people not have to necessarily do it through the SEC and raise money. And then, obviously, Titles 5 and 6 allowed companies to not have to report with the SEC. Defer reporting with the SEC, which then allows them to save the money that they might otherwise spend on compliance costs and use that for internal purposes for whatever it might be. So that kind of leads me then to what was the actual impetus for the JOBS Act itself. And I think the easy answer is Congress. But a sort of a short way, I think, of looking at it when you take all of those things together is really the cost of raising capital in today's environment and the costs of being a public company. Those costs can be tremendous, particularly for smaller companies, where it can make the difference in deciding whether or not to be a public company, and can also make the difference in how they raise capital in the first place. I think if you look at it, though, on a bigger scale, what you're going to see that I think, and because the various provisions are targeted at different audiences and address different issues, there are a lot of factors that were the impetus here. Besides Congress, we have the stagnation in the IPO markets. We have the SEC itself. We have the speed and ease of communications in the internet age not being reflected in the securities laws, and the perceived adverse impact that was having on capital raising, particularly by companies in certain industries like tech and life sciences and some of those. We have the costs of being a public company. We also have the view that not being able to access the capital markets resulted in companies not being able to get started, or if they were able to get started, to be able to grow and employ more people. One of the things that helps support the acronym, the JOBS Act. So I want to take a little bit of time and look at these in just a little bit more detail. Excuse me. So let's start with Congress. Obviously, Congress thought something needed to be done. Part of that's political, and the ability to show their constituencies that they were taking some action. When you think about it, the JOBS Act, although it was adopted in 2012, was in process a long time before that. We're after 2008, 2009, the economic realities of what the United States and the world was going through at that time, and stuff like that. But also, and if you take a look at it from a political perspective, the short title was obviously created for political convenience. But part of it also reflects the reality of the slow recovery from the economic downturn and the perception that some of the securities laws were hindering companies in their ability to raise capital, which hindered their ability to recover from the downturn. And I think a lot of people in the market were talking to their congresspeople about these issues and wondering whether something could be done and trying to get something done that would provide some benefit to them. Some of this goes back to the rules and legislation that was put in place many years ago and has never been revisited or updated to reflect updates and practices, doesn't reflect the computer age, doesn't reflect the internet age. Practices that may have worked just fine in 1960 or 1980 don't really work all that well in 2000 or 2010. For example, maybe one example of this is that the ability to restrict the dissemination of information was much easier before the internet, much easier before we had computers, much easier before we had smartphones. Or it also would not really have been economically feasible in 1960 to necessarily do crowdfunding, where you needed to print documents, you needed to mail them out, you needed to be able to distribute them. Now you can just be able to do something on your computer, hit a button, send it. It just doesn't, the securities laws never reflected that. Another issue lies with the SEC itself. According to the SEC and its mission statement, its mission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and I'm sorry I'm reading, but I want to make sure I get it right, and facilitate capital formation. On some level, there's almost always a conflict between various aspects of their mission, the protection of investors and facilitating capital formation. What might be viewed as necessary for the protection of investors almost always is going to be viewed as hindering or adversely impacting the capital formation markets. I think that's one of the delicate challenges the SEC always faces in its rulemaking process. I think in this tug of war, while the SEC is cognizant of the impact their rules have had on capital formation, I would say more often than not that the SEC leans to the investor protection side of the equation as opposed to the facilitation of capital formation side of the equation. There are some exceptions to that, but I think that tends to be more where they would go. And I think when you think about the amount of disclosures issuers provide today, and think about whether they're designed to protect investors or facilitate capital formation, I think you are able to come to some easy conclusions on that. Also think about the cost that goes into preparing those disclosures. You have the advisor time, the lawyer time. You have the drafter time. In today's world, we have disclosure committees, so all of the people participating on those, their time. The internal processes to support the CEO and CFO certifications, and all of those things, which just add up to time and cost in being a public company. Obviously, doing all of that protects companies from a liability perspective, but I'm not really sure that it helps much from facilitating capital formation generally. In recognition of the impact the cost of complying on smaller companies has had, there's long been a discussion about treating smaller companies differently under the federal securities laws than larger or more established companies. If you're a large company, while the costs are large, you're generally able to better absorb those costs. Whereas if you're a smaller company, those costs can be overwhelming and can make the difference in deciding whether to become a public company. The way the SEC has addressed this has changed over time. At one point, the SEC had different forms set up specifically for smaller reporting companies, so they were just subject to their own little reporting regime, separate and apart from larger companies. That's now changed. Those forms have been eliminated. Now I think what you need to do is look at the various disclosure requirements and decide whether or not a smaller reporting company can take advantage of them. It again leads to having to rely on advisors more than just a person being able to look at a form. You need to look at, for example, you need to look at Regulation SK. Look at each of the items. Item 101, description of business. There's a lengthy item requirement as to what disclosure you have to provide, but at the end there's a description that if you're a smaller reporting company, you only have to do X, Y, and Z. You look at some of the other item requirements, you have the same thing. MD&A is a fairly extensive disclosure that people provide, but there can be relief for smaller reporting companies, and the same with executive compensation. I think another issue from the SEC perspective is a lack of consistency in what the SEC considers a smaller reporting company that may need special consideration. By my count, there are at least 4 different definitions of smaller reporting company that percolate through the SEC's rules or through its practices. The SEC currently defines a smaller reporting company as a company that has a public float of less than $75 million. That number hasn't changed for many years, but it also doesn't provide much room in today's environment for companies to grow before they become subject to full reporting. And once a smaller reporting company exceeds that $75 million threshold, they're then subject to full-blown reporting, and they have less than a year in order to phase into that reporting system. But look at what Congress did when they defined emerging growth company in the Jobs Act. They defined it as a company with total gross revenues of $1 billion or less. There's a big difference between $75 million market cap on one hand and $1 billion of revenue on the other hand. And they also created in the Jobs Act a 5-year phase-in period for between when you become subject to full-blown reporting. So we have the SEC's rules, which provide a one-year phase-in once you exceed a $75 million market cap, and the Jobs Act, which has a 5-year period. Similarly, there's a big difference between when the SEC thinks companies should have to start filing annual reports and other reports under the Exchange Act and when Congress thinks this should happen. As I said earlier, the SEC has their rules have had a limit of once you have 500 holders of record. Congress changed this as general to 2,000 shareholders or 500 non-accredited investors, which again allows companies to attract more investors before they have to go in and be subject to full-blown reporting. And there's another definition of smaller reporting company floating around the SEC, although it doesn't reside in any specific rule. In 2011, the SEC established the SEC Advisory Committee on Small and Emerging Companies. This committee provides advice to the SEC on its rules, regulations, and policies. For purposes of this committee, they define smaller and emerging companies as those with less than $250 million in public market cap. So they didn't even use their existing definition of smaller reporting company. They went with something a little larger. But again, we have a big difference between $250 million market cap and $1 billion in revenues. It's sort of interesting to note when you think about going back to the SEC's mission and how it sort of led their rules to get to be how they are, that the SEC has this advisory committee on small business and emerging companies from which it seeks advice. It also has a general investor advisory committee from which it seeks advice, but it doesn't have a committee from its general registrant community from which it seeks occasional advice. And so I think that sort of provides an idea as to which way the SEC leans when it's trying to figure out its conflicting statements in its mission. The voices for relief from the expenses of complying with the federal securities laws by many issuers, but particularly smaller issuers, grew with the adoption of Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002. Think about the impact Sarbanes-Oxley had on on public companies. Among some of the other things that it required were listed companies have audit committees comprised of independent directors that had certain authorities and obligations. It required CEO and CFO certifications, which led to disclosure committees and the processes necessary to provide comfort to the certifiers. It required up-the-ladder reporting for attorneys, more disclosures with respect to off-balance sheet transactions and pro forma numbers. It required management to assess the adequacy of its internal controls, and it required auditors to report on their views of the adequacy of that assessment. The list goes on. Many of these provisions soon became best practices for all public companies, whether or not they actually were subject to them, which obviously resulted in significantly increased compliance costs. And then the boards of private companies and other entities, we've even seen it with nonprofits, began thinking that many of these practices should apply to them. So, it just has been filtering down. It increases the cost for everybody. The voices for relief from the expenses grew even stronger with the adoption of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. Some of the things that the Dodd-Frank Act did were, just like Sarbanes-Oxley created these requirements for audit committees and its members, the Dodd-Frank Act extended that to compensation committees. It also required disclosure of public company use of compensation consultants and other compensation committee advisors. It gave the SEC authority to implement proxy access, which the SEC spent time doing and then was overturned in the courts. It also did things like it required say-on-pay and say-on-pay frequency votes at annual meetings. It directed the SEC to adopt new provisions dealing with pay for performance and pay ratio disclosures. It did things like require conflict minerals disclosures, resource extraction disclosures, disclosures with regard by people who are in the coal and other mine industry, and things like that. As with Dodd-Frank, I think it's expected that many of those provisions are going to become best practices by all public companies, whether or not they're subject to the provision, as well as by private companies whose boards are populated with people who also serve on boards of public companies and wonder why some of those practices don't equally apply to them. So with that as background, why don't I now turn to what my thoughts are for the outlook for the Jobs Act. I think anyone's view of the success of the Jobs Act will be on how you measure success. If the measure of success of the Jobs Act is to be the number of jobs created, I'm skeptical that anyone will consider the Jobs Act to be successful. Obviously, this will be for the economists and other experts to decide several years down the road after all of the rules have been implemented and have had a chance to play out. But I have my doubts that it will have any significant impact on the number of people employed. But if we measure success of the Jobs Act by how much the provisions are used by issuers and whether it reduces the cost of capital raising, which amounts can then be reinvested in the business, which I suppose could include adding jobs, I do have some thoughts on that. I think it's interesting to note that 3 of the provisions of the Jobs Act, Title I dealing with emerging growth companies and Titles 5 and 6 dealing with the ability to defer when you had to register under the Exchange Act, did not require SEC rulemaking, and 3 have required rulemaking. And my outlook sort of varies depending on which bucket the title fits into. I think the 3 that did not require SEC rulemaking were taken advantage of almost immediately upon enactment. We all knew that they were coming, and there were some issuers, particularly with regard to some of the provisions of emerging growth companies, who did their first confidential submissions to the SEC within days of adoption of the Jobs Act. They were just waiting for the provision to be adopted so they could start using it. With regard to the provision that was adopted this week, I think it's a little too early. That just became effective this week, sorry. I think it's a little too early for us to know how that one's going to be viewed by the marketplace. But again, there are a lot of interest by people who wanted to know what they can do and what they can't do. And on the panel, we'll be discussing that in more detail. So that sort of leaves us then, I think, with the 3 titles that were not effective automatically, and that were subject to SEC rulemaking. So we have the general ability to generally solicit. That provision just became effective this week, as I had said earlier. And you might wonder why it took the SEC so long. It's not like the SEC or the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance has nothing to do. The short answer is that they have limited resources, a lot of items on their plate, and therefore have to prioritize their activities. They still have to review the filings that get made with the SEC and assist companies in the public questions that issuers raise. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, the SEC is required to review the filings of every issuer at least once every 3 years. Registration statements still must be reviewed and declared effective. Interpretive questions must still be analyzed and answered. The SEC is still trying to finish its unfinished rulemakings from Dodd-Frank. It's involved in significant multi-agency projects involving derivatives and credit risk retention by securitizers of asset-backed securities. Those projects are viewed as significant in preventing a repeat of our last economic crisis and are both time-consuming and controversial. Some of the other Dodd-Frank provisions that require the SEC and the Division of Corporation Finance's attention for rules that haven't been adopted yet are the pay-for-performance provisions, which require each public company to provide information showing the relationship between executive compensation actually paid and the financial performance of the company. Another rulemaking from Dodd-Frank that still is pending is the internal pay comparison, which requires a public company to disclose the median of the annual total compensation to all employees of the company except the CEO, the annual total compensation of the CEO, and the ratio of those two numbers. That provision, and if you think about this, Dodd-Frank was adopted in 2010. That provision was just proposed by the SEC last week. The SEC is still required to do compensation clawbacks, which requires them to direct stock exchanges to prohibit the listing of securities of a company that doesn't develop and implement a policy with regard to clawing back incentive-based compensation where there's been a financial restatement. This one, the markets are sort of getting ahead of the SEC. It is becoming more common practice for companies to try to implement something with regard to clawback. So it'll be interesting to see when the SEC and the stock exchanges finally move on that one, where they are in relation to how market practice is developing. A couple of the other provisions the SEC was required to do by Dodd-Frank, and it adopted. One is resource extraction, which requires disclosure of payments made to governments in connection with resource extraction activities. The SEC spent a lot of time on that rulemaking process, a lot of effort, and the rules were overturned by the court. It's gone back to the SEC, who's decided not to appeal that, but is going to probably do additional rule writing. And then there's conflict minerals, which requires disclosure of whether conflict minerals, as defined by the SEC, are necessary to the functionality or production of a product manufactured by that company. That was another controversial and lengthy rulemaking. Those rules were adopted. Those rules were upheld by the court, but they're now subject to an appeal. So the SEC spends a lot of time on its rulemaking that it already had on its plate before the Jobs Act, before it even is able to get to the Jobs Act. I think another thing going on at the SEC has been the turnover at the SEC. As an example, since the Jobs Act was enacted, the SEC has a new chair, 2 other new commissioners, and a new director of the Division of Corporation Finance. And the Division of Corporation Finance itself has 2 unfilled deputy director positions, as well as an unfilled chief counsel position. Inevitably, the change in leadership and the unfilled positions have slowed down the rulemaking process. And then besides those provisions that I've talked about, the SEC has other significant rulemaking that they're undertaking for a variety of reasons. One is reform of the money market fund industry, securities swaps regulation, which was also primarily mandated by Dodd-Frank, and some other matters. Another thing from the SEC front is that they've also generally received comment letters from the public seeking rulemaking. Some of the things that the SEC has gotten since the adoption of the Jobs Act are petitions for rulemaking covering things like alternative disclosures to existing disclosure requirements, amendments to Rule 10b5-1 governing insider trading plans, and the adoption of neutral Internet voting platforms. The staff attention has to be paid to all of these to all of these petitions for rulemaking and trying to decide how to proceed and whether or not it's something that they should put on their calendar. And I think added to the fact that all of this that's on the SEC's front is that all of their rulemakings lately seem to generate a lot of controversy, whether it's political, social, or other. There's many different constituencies that the SEC has to satisfy as part of their rulemakings. Before it proposes rulemakings, the SEC listens to many of these different constituencies and what they have to say, tries to take them into account when formulating its proposals. The SEC spends significant amount of time trying to reconcile various competing viewpoints, but it can't always be done. Think again back to the conflicts in the SEC's mission and the SEC trying to decide what it's going to do. And I think the final thing from the SEC perspective is litigation. If you practice in this area, and this is a relatively new phenomenon, is that the SEC has to be very cognizant of, but several of their recent rulemakings, as I've mentioned, have been subject to litigation and challenged in the courts. They've lost most of them, have won at least one. But this adds to the time it takes the SEC on the rulemaking front. Back when I was at the SEC, the fact that something might be challenged or sued, although you were aware of that, it was not something that you spent a lot of time trying to make sure you were trying to address as you were drafting and talking with people. Now I think they want to make sure they get it right from the procedural perspective. One final thing that maybe I'll talk about that is delaying, it is causing the SEC some heartburn that I think will cause them to go slow on some of these remaining provisions of the Jobs Act, is the possibility that certain of the changes made by the Jobs Act will increase fraudulent activity. I think so what they're trying to be cognizant of and trying to address is whether there needs to be some sort of increased monitoring and enforcement of market participants. So I think that participants who are trying to take advantage of some of the Jobs Act provision, particularly crowdfunding, and maybe even some of the activities in the general solicitation area, ought to be aware of the fact and should expect a heightened regulatory scrutiny of the practices that develop. So what is my outlook for these final three provisions? I think the good news is that, as we all know and as I've mentioned, in July the SEC adopted the general solicitation provisions from the Jobs Act and the bad actor provisions from Dodd-Frank, and they both became effective this week. Reflecting the controversy that even these seemingly straightforward to adopt provisions engendered, at the same time that they were adopted by the SEC proposed a number of changes to Reg D and Form D. Those changes would do things like require the filing of a Form D before an issuer engages in a general solicitation. They would require a final Form D at the end of an offering. They would require written submission materials to be submitted to the SEC for a short temporary period of 2 years. They would disqualify issuers from relying on Rule 506 if issuers didn't comply with certain requirements, including filing of a Form D in past offerings. They also would substantially expand the items that must be disclosed in a 4D. I think they are proposing to amend 8 of the items and add 6 or 7 new items. So what the SEC gave with one hand by adopting general solicitation, they're proposing to take back with the other. So I think that people who are proposing to do general solicitations, particularly if it's part of an ongoing offering that may last for an extended period of time, are going to want to monitor these proposed changes and consider them in deciding how they want to proceed with their offering. Which leaves me now with the outlook for 2 remaining Jobs Act provisions, crowdfunding and Reg A+. Crowdfunding was an interesting provision to follow as the Jobs Act proceeded through Congress. And some of the panelists, maybe Anne-Marie, when we get there, may have some interesting views on this provision or some of the other provisions. But as it was first drafted, it was extremely bare bones and looked like it could be easily used without much expense or compliance concerns. It didn't require SEC rulemaking to implement. It really seemed to just contemplate a person posting on the internet their idea for a product and seeking to sell shares of stock for some minimal amount per share. It didn't need regulatory action to implement, and the issuer really didn't need much in the line of advisors. It really was using Kickstarter to sell securities. What could go wrong with something like that? As you can expect, a number of concerns were raised, particularly by regulators and small investor advocates, with the lack of controls on the process and the fact that this would be a prime area for people to commit fraud and to steal from the small investor. In response to critics, Congress made a number of revisions to the crowdfunding provision, the result of which being that I am not hopeful that this provision will ever be widely used as a fundraising tool. First, the SEC needs action to propose and adopt rules. And we're not clear when the SEC might do this. It might be possible we'll see a proposal in the next several months based on recent history, but I don't expect that we're going to see a final rule in the near future. Second, a person using this process is going to need advisors to help them go through all of this. So if they can only raise $1 million and they have to pay for advisors, that's not going to leave a lot of money left to be able to use on further developing a product, taking their idea and trying to make it into something useful. Where I do think this provision will ultimately be useful is as a marketing type tool in building buzz about a company or about a product and maybe adding a little bit of equity in the company's capital structure. Think an internet company and what it does today. The company will raise substantial sums from a few large investors, but it will be able to use crowdfunding to generate buzz about either the company, the product that it has, the idea that it has, and will be able to use crowdfunding to raise small amounts of capital but get all of this information out there. I think this is really the type of company that can afford to take advantage of this provision. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that the SEC makes this provision a little bit user-friendly, but I am not overly optimistic. And then there is Reg A+. As I said at the beginning, to me this is a sleeper provision of the Jobs Act and is really slipping under the radar screen. Issuers are going to be able to raise up to $50 million. The securities can be sold publicly and they won't be restricted. Because this is subject to SEC rulemaking, it's going to be interesting to see. We have not really seen much in the line of comment letters going to the SEC ahead of time, trying to, like we have with some of the other provision. I think crowdfunding has generated in the thousands of pre-rulemaking comment letters. I think that Reg A Plus has about 20. Crowdfunding has people very, very strong, very specific points of view. Reg A Plus really doesn't. So maybe there will not be the large outcry for the SEC to try to make this a very difficult process to be able to use. And I'm hopeful that people will be able to convince the SEC to try to make this a very useful provision and not take away any strong incentives to use this provision. With that, I think what I'm going to do is end the opening remarks so we can then, unless somebody has questions, but like I said, we'll also be sitting here on the panel and be able to take them then, and we'll look forward to them. But I thank you for the opportunity to sort of talk about my views of the impetus and the outlook for the Jobs Act. Thanks.